Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. I'm starting up what will probably be another new series where every now and then I'll take a brief look at some of the worst arcade to home console ports on one or more platforms. I'm still playing around with the format here, so I might do some episodes where I stick to one console, others where I spread the love to several. I don't know, we'll see how things go. Now before anyone gets angry or takes things very personally here, let me tell you that this doesn't mean I think the home systems that these games appear on are bad. It also doesn't mean I think the original arcade game is necessarily good. It just means the port, or conversion if you must, is seriously lacking and is a shadow of the original arcade experience. For this inaugural episode, I'll be looking at 3 Atari games and their disappointing home versions on both major 16-bit consoles of the era, the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive, and the Super Nintendo/Super Famicom. We'll begin our festival of filth with Pit Fighter, take things to the road with Race Drivin, and finish our course of absolute crap with Steel Talons. I'll show you the arcade, Genesis, and Super Nintendo versions of each game and explain what went wrong with each. And settle down, keyboard warriors, I know in all cases the arcade versions were on much more advanced hardware, we'll talk about that too. And for anyone still caught up in the 90s console wars, relax. In each case here, the versions of these games for both consoles were completely inadequate, so everybody loses. Alright, let's get on with it. You might think that Pit Fighter was the first fighting game ever made to use digitized characters. If you think that,
well, you're wrong!
That honor belongs to Reikai Doshi, Chinese exorcist. But it used claymation characters rather than actual humans. Still, they were digitized, so that counts. But anyway, here's Atari's Pit Fighter. The arcade version was visually pretty fancy when it came out back in 1990 on Atari's G1 arcade board. There really wasn't much else like it. It had digitized humans as all the characters and background people, it used scaling on the sprites and backgrounds, and overall was pretty damn impressive looking for the time it came out, if nothing else. Pit Fighter has its fans, but I have to say I'm not one of them. If you love this game, more power to you, keep loving what you love. But in my personal opinion, the gameplay is sloppy and extremely unrefined. Once you get past the wow factor, there really just wasn't a whole lot there. But you could absolutely have some quick fun with it for a couple of quarters, and I indulged in it every now and then. And if you wanted to take it on with friends, it supported up to 3 players at a time, which was nice. And man, were those sprites huge. So hey, how about you strip out the one thing, the visuals, that made the arcade version such a sensation, and replace those large characters with itty-bitty teensy-weensy ones? Well, that's just what happened to the ports to the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo/Super Famicom back in the day. We'll look at the Genesis version first, which is regarded by many as the best of the console ports. This, right here, this thing you're watching, it's not good. We lose all the scaling, everything is small, like I just said, and all of the wow factor from the arcade release of the time is just gone. And geez, guys, what's with the swastika-shaped shuriken? How did no one realize that that was a bad idea? Anyway, gameplay-wise, if you're a fan of Pit Fighter, the Genesis version is tolerable, I guess. I did own and play this back in the day, but in the end, I sure don't recommend anyone play it today. Speaking of things I don't recommend, here's the SNES version now. Yeah, this one is regarded as one of the worst arcade ports to ever hit the Super Nintendo. And the theory behind it is, how about we slow down the Genesis version, throw in some very cheap hits, remove some characters, remove all the weapons, and make the controls even less responsive. To offset all of that, let's add just a smidge more color here and there, but somehow still manage to make it even uglier than the Genesis one. Yeah, this is garbo, folks. I'd call SNES Pit Fighter a pile of shit, but I'd hate to insult actual piles of shit like that. This game is only worth trying to be utterly flabbergasted at how a disaster of these proportions could have ever happened. When fights start out, your character dances like an idiot, completely defenseless, you can't move them around, and they often take hits, and sometimes the opponent just bashes you over and over, and in some circumstances, recovery is impossible, so you just lose the match instantly. In the arcade version, your character only did the quick little dance when you continued, by the way. And like I said, so much is missing from this game, it's shocking. This one feels more like a proof of concept than an actual retail release. And while I originally didn't plan on showing you the Amiga version of Pit Fighter, I think I want to do that, because I want to show you this and how much more arcade authentic the experience is. And you can see this one is a lot more similar to the arcade one than what we got on the 16-bit consoles. And hey, it still ain't great, so temper those expectations. But still, this was a better game that felt more like the actual arcade Pit Fighter than either of the home console versions that we got. I mean, they even managed to replicate the scaling and everything. Not bad, Amiga Pit Fighter developers. Anyway, when all is said and done, the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions of Pit Fighter could have been so much better than they were. They were never going to match the arcade original with its much more impressive hardware and gigantic sprites and scaling and all that stuff, but still, they didn't have to turn out like they did. The general consensus about these games, even back when they were new, was that they were a disappointment. Alrighty, here's our second game of the day. Atari's 1992 polygonal sequel to Hard Drivin', which continued the company's war with the letter G, none other than Race Drivin'. Yeah, Atari was doing the polygon thing long before Sega in the arcade, but the jump from this stuff to Model 1 and then the Model 2 was pretty astounding back then, but that was all to come later. When it came out, Race Drivin' was pretty cool, and I got the chance to try it out a few times. It looked nice with relatively fast and smooth graphics for the era, but this is another game that I have to say just wasn't exactly my thing. Still, I did appreciate the more simmy feeling of it, offering something different from other arcade racing games of the day, which were generally either of the overhead or superscalar variety. Now here's the arcade version next to the Genesis version. Yikes. Yeah, the Genesis didn't have any of that special hardware that made calculating those polygons in the arcade version fast and relatively smooth. Despite that, while I wouldn't call it a good port exactly, it's not terrible. But I still think it fits the theme of the episode here because it is really nothing compared to the arcade version. You could have a little fun with this one if you really love the arcade original. It was relatively speedy compared to several of the other home ports, but this is one that anyone who wasn't already a huge fan of the arcade original would probably not have enjoyed and would have happily left alone. Next up, here's a look at the Super Nintendo version of the game. Yikes. The colors are nicer than the Genesis version, no question there, but if there's more than just a few strips of straight road on the screen, this thing chugs like crazy. The Genesis version was relatively speedy, even when there was a fair amount of stuff on screen, but this version's frame rate gets reduced to single digits when that kind of thing happens. I'd call it borderline unplayable. The controls feel absolutely awful. While the Genesis games back when its port came out might have been considered a bit disappointing, Super Nintendo fans that ended up with this one might have been downright devastated. So yeah, neither of the home versions of Race Drivin' are good or recommended. But allow me to add a footnote here that people will be angry if I don't discuss. There's an SA1 hack of Race Drivin' that dramatically, and I mean dramatically, improves the performance of the SNES game and makes it by far the most impressive 16-bit port. The SA1, for those unaware, was one of the many enhancement chips available for the SNES that was much faster than the system's standard CPU and made stuff like what you're seeing now possible. This is performance superior to the arcade release, even though the geometry is less complex and it happens in a small window. Still, it's too bad we couldn't have had something like this back in the day, right? This would have blown a lot of people away. But nope, instead, we had this. Sorry 16-bit consoles, both of your ports of Race Drivin' were ultimately letdowns. Let's finish off today with some helicopter action.
Get to the chopper!
Here's a look at Atari's Steel Talons, another polygonal game that was a bit more ambitious than their previous racing titles. Steel Talons was perhaps a smidge barren, but it was generally very visually impressive. I always thought it was cool despite looking a little bit on the plain side. And there are some very cool uses of scenery here and there, like when you have to follow the river through the canyon in Mission 3. Steel Talons was pretty unique when it came out, but a lot of arcades went nutso and were charging 4 quarters for a single play of this back in 1991. I tried it just a few times and then backed away, because there was no way I was going to throw that kind of money at this game on a regular basis. The gameplay itself, it's pretty good. There's a lot of controls, it's a little complicated, but you can get used to it. Now, once again, the arcade hardware powering this game was considerably more advanced than either the Genesis or Super Nintendo, so there just wasn't any way we were going to see anything remotely close to the arcade version on either console. Instead, we got a couple of highly compromised versions of the game, neither of which likely made any fans of the original especially happy. So a year after the arcade's 1991 release, that'd be 1992 for those of you keeping track, we saw some home versions, including this one here for the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive. And unsurprisingly, the graphics just chugged along in this version of the game. It has a simpler look overall than the arcade version, the controls are way cut back, and everything just feels smaller and scaled down. So when compared to stuff like Race Drivin, the levels here are significantly more complex, and there's a lot more of the landscape viewable at any one time because of that. But Steel Talons practically becomes a slideshow at times. If you wanted the arcade experience at home, you just weren't going to get it here. Now, we were often satisfied with less back in those days because it was just the nature of hardware differences between the arcade and the home. So hardcore Steel Talons fans may have extracted a modicum of joy out of this one, but it was a far cry from the arcade original. Now, a year after the Genesis release, 1993 this time, Steel Talons found its way onto the Super Nintendo. And I give the devs some credit here. They tried a different approach, knowing full well the SNES, like the Genesis, just wouldn't be able to push the amount of polygons the arcade version could. So the developers simplified the ground, giving it far fewer features, and yes, when more than a few polygons get on the screen on this one, it does suffer some pretty serious slowdown. And it resembles the arcade version visually even less than the Genesis version, but at times it is a bit faster because of how scaled back the scenery is. And credit where it's due, they included the river mission for Mission 3 with lots of canyons, and while it's vastly simpler than the arcade version and chugs like crazy, it's here. Super Nintendo Steel Talons, while it was an interesting attempt at bringing the game home, still just really didn't work in my opinion. While it's faster and plainer than the Genesis version much of the time, it also feels just very much emptier than that version, and the control is just off. There's way more inertia when you're moving the helicopter around than either the arcade or Genesis versions, meaning it's really difficult to turn at times. So which of these two Steel Talons home ports is better? I'm not really a fan of either one of them, so if you guys want, you could fight that one out in the comments. Alright, that's enough. I can't take any more today. Pit Fighter, Race Drivin, and Steel Talons, your home console versions made people sad. You disappointed loads of kids and teens in the early 1990s. For shame.
Shame! Shame!
So next time I do this, I won't pick on Atari anymore, I promise. But I wanted to have a bit of a theme for the first episode at least. So what did you guys think? Do you like this idea for a video series? Would you like to see more of it? Want to yell at me for trampling a bit on a game that you loved as a child? Go ahead and leave a comment. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it online somewhere. That's the only way my little channel here can grow. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through super thanks and channel memberships. And by the way, I recently retooled those tiers. They start at 99 cents now. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.